The Odyssey. A new movie that sure made itself become the subject of a lot of discussions and controversies. Some people love it, some people hate it. A vocal portion of noisy people think it's spitting on Homer's works and an affront to Greek mythology. Discussions around the movie are a mess. I've seen it just a few days ago, and my intent in this video isn't to tear apart the movie nor to sing its glory. Instead, I am more concerned about a specific type of defense I've seen ever since the movie's trailers dropped, and even before that when we had glimpses of it. And I still see it thrown around in regards to some of the controversial direction choices in this adaptation. So, some people have been criticizing the movie in regards to how accurate it was in its representation of ancient Greece as early as the first trailers. And to this day, this specific criticism only gained more and more traction. And the response to this was usually something along the lines of, "The Odyssey is a myth, it didn't happen. It's fiction, it's fantasy, or it literally has a cyclops in it and you expect it to be historically accurate?" And I can't believe it needs to be said, but yes, the story of the Odyssey, the main plot, is a myth. It's a legend, it's fictional. But the setting of the Odyssey is not. Ancient Greece is a real place that has existed, even if the adventures of Odysseus did not happen. And in the case of Nolan's Odyssey, it explicitly takes place in Mediterranean Bronze Age. It's literally said explicitly in the movie that it's the setting that was chosen. So trying to defend Nolan's direction in regards to the armors, costumes, locations, and boats not matching with accurate representation of ancient Greece by saying, well, the story is fictional, completely misses the mark. If the movie was taking place in a reimagined Greece with no historical mark, or a made-up fictional setting that merely reprises some elements from Greek mythology, like its monsters, sure, but it's not the case at all. The movie setting is clearly meant to be ancient Greece, so shocker, people will expect it to look like ancient Greece. I'm sorry, but you can't just point to the movie having Cyclops and sirens in it as an excuse to enwave people rightfully pointing out that it's weird that Odysseus and co are using Viking boats. This is something I was feeling long before seeing the movie, but now that I have seen the movie, then I feel that this defense is even way worse because fantasy was not even something that Nolan himself aimed at, and I can confidently say that. When I watched the movie, it was very clear to me that the way that Nolan tried to depict the story was more aligned with an attempt at making it feel more realistic, grounded, and historical in the poem, and it's something that a lot of people have noted. For example, the gods aren't present in the same way that they are in the poem. Instead of communicating with each other and taking on shapes before intervening in the mortal world and messing with the lives of the people in there, they are mostly felt. We see them through the lens of interpretation, which is an interesting way to depict how men were seeing things as proof of the divine. Zeus won't appear on screen, but he will be felt through the thunder. Poseidon won't appear on screen, but he will be felt through the sea, and so on. Athena, instead of playing an actual role in the plot, is clearly meant to be embodying Odysseus' guilt. She is what ties him to Ithaca and Penelope through the brooch, but she is also the reminder of the sins he committed in Troy. Circe doesn't appear as a powerful sorceress living in a golden, luxurious island, but as a woman living alone in an island in ruin, with implications that her turning Odysseus' men into animals is a result of trauma that she has experienced at the end of other sailors that came to visit. Calypso isn't a nymph living in a gorgeous palace, she lives in a desert, and it's suggested that Odysseus is the one seeing her as more than a woman. The movie even has Odysseus suggesting that the real reason why they are going to war isn't because they're trying to save Helen, but because Agamemnon wants to have control over the sea market. The list goes on. This on its own is an interesting way to consider the Odyssey, but this means that the movie doesn't feel like a fantasy at all, and it's clearly not trying to be that. Everything that in the poem was sort of dramatized for the sake of the epicness and wondrous has been reinterpreted to feel more grounded. There's been a bit of a controversy over the fact that the movie doesn't have the nobody trick and that instead Odysseus and his men just blind body famous and then Odysseus shoots him a second time for some reasons. This I believe Nolan tried to justify by saying that the pun doesn't work in translation. For context, nobody in ancient Greek is Otis, which sounds a bit like Odysseus, which could be what he's referring to. However, I don't think it's the extent of that reasoning. After all, countless adaptations have accepted that even if the pun isn't perfect, they'd have to settle for the imperfect translation rather than giving up on one of the scenes that most perfectly showcases Odysseus as a trickster. Now I think that instead, what really motivated this change is how out there this ploy feels. This specific part of the Odyssey can also be found in other legends or tales. For example, the story of the fairy Hansel. Hansel means myself, and it is the name of a fairy. This fairy met a boy who told her his name was My Hansel. And so, when the boy injured the fairy and the mother of the fairy came to see her, she told her that my own self, my Hansel, injured my foot. This is ATU 1137. The self did it, which all involve a pattern of a character telling to another one that they are named myself or nobody, all sharing this similarity with the Odyssey. That's what I mean by how out there it feels. It's not realistic to have a dialogue like that where someone freely accepts that you are named nobody or myself, no matter the language, but transpose it to English and it feels even more so. So in reality, in omitting it, Nolan already demystified the encounter with Polyphemus. When I see stuff like this, I don't get fantasy. I get someone trying to portray a known legend through a more grounded standpoint. And regardless of whether or not you agree with this choice, this means that Nolan never tried to embrace the idea of fantasy in that movie, and that therefore, you cannot defend it under this claim. It isn't an appropriate representation of what the Odyssey movie was trying to be. It's just an argument thrown in an attempt at deflecting from criticism against the lack of accuracy of the movie's direction, despite it being an interesting criticism in regards to the movie. I feel like people's attempt at defending the movie misunderstand that when we are pointing out at the lack of accuracy in it, it's not because we were expecting this movie to teach us anything about historical ancient Greece, but because historical fiction has its own way of making us travel. A work of fiction has the ability to make you travel to a whole other world, and that's what people find appealing in heroic fantasy or science fiction. But when it comes to historical fiction, what is appealing is the idea that it allows you to travel through time and see things that you could have never seen. It's different from going to a museum because instead of seeing the ruins of the past, you can get to see the people who lived at the time in their environment, or at least a simulation of it. For example, there's this short story by Théophile Gautier called Aria Marcella that tells the story of three friends visiting the ruins of Pompeii. At night, the protagonist, Octavien, returns to the ruins and finds Pompeii alive. It's a fantastic short story, meaning that the supernatural in it is left ambiguous. So it could be that Octavien did travel through time, but he could also have dreamed all of that because of alcohol since he was found passed out in the ruins. This ability to travel through time is what makes people enjoy historical fiction. This sees its own set of immersion and allows the narrative to work in a specific setting where insane events took place. Conspiracies, wars, and not in a distant land that never existed, but in a real time, in the real world that we just didn't happen to be able to live because we didn't exist yet. That's the appeal of it. That's why you find stories like How Can a Man Show or Red River, where the protagonist, Carol and Yui, represent this desire to know about this time long past beyond looking at ruins and trying to decipher them, a desire to be there as an actor or a witness. But when you wish to travel to ancient Greece and instead you're met with people riding a vinking boat, rather gloomy places, and American contemporary dialogue, you can only travel so far. When I watched the movie, there were moments where seeing this completely broke my sense of immersion. For example, when Odysseus and the men inside the horse go through the walls of Troy, I was genuinely invested. I felt the emergency of the situation, the panic of the Troy soldiers who realized only too late they had been tricked and tried to stop the Greeks from opening the gates. The Greeks fighting to defend themselves while they opened the gate, the drum sound growing louder and louder. And then, I see Agamemnon with his hammer and I'm out of the scene! I swear, every time I was looking at Agamemnon's hammer or the Viking ships, I felt myself lied to. Every single time that a character was telling me the story was taking place in Greece, Bronze Age, I was feeling like I was being scammed. Even when I tried to get used to the Trojan wearing this weird white armor and the Greeks this weird black armor, there was something else on screen in regards to the visual that just took me out. That is why the criticism of historical accuracy and Greek culture being not present enough in a movie that takes place in Greece is something I agree with. Because it works against the movie to have characters telling us we are in the Bronze Age, Greece, and then it doesn't look like it. The movie is in a weird contradiction where it is trying to present a demystified version of the Odyssey, feeling more realistic and psychological and less epic and dramatized, but it also refuses to resemble actual Greece, which, again, it could have been so easily avoided if it was taking place in a different setting that is merely inspired by ancient Greece or a reimagined version of it. That's the case of the Hercules the Legendary Journey series. It doesn't take place in a specific version of Greece but a fantasy version of it. Whether you agree that this is acceptable or not at all is debatable, but it's making it clear to the audience that the choices that were made for the series weren't interested with historical accuracy. It was trying to be its own thing. The Odyssey, however, doesn't communicate that when it has characters talk about the fact that they are in the Bronze Age, in Greece, and with the way that the few supernatural elements are handled. For as much as people like to bring up the Cyclops as a way to justify the idea that Nolan has the right to not be accurate to Greek history in a movie that he chose to set in the Bronze Age, real Greece, the scene with Polyphemus is actually a good example of the movies presenting supernatural elements in a way that doesn't feel fantastical. Yes, Cyclops don't exist. And I am actually surprised that Nolan resisted the temptation of making Polyphemus into a regular shepherd that suffers from Cyclopia. But what I'm talking about here is the presentation of the monster and the reaction of Odysseus and his crew. The scene where Polyphemus appears and hits some of the men was genuinely one of my favorite moments in the movie. That scene was great. However, when looking back on it, it really paints Polyphemus in how it would be seen. He's not talking for quite a long time until they blind him and he begs Poseidon for vengeance. So instead he appears as an alien presence that is made all the more threatening by how silent he is, and the ever-present risks of being eaten away by him. And when the crew sees him, they are not trying to communicate in any way, mainly focusing on hiding and escaping. On the one hand, this makes sense and makes the Cyclops appear as something that is feared by the regular people that we are. That's what makes this scene also very effective. But this also means that the sense of fantasy isn't there. In the poem, the Odyssey, Polyphemus is the one who talks with Odysseus and his men before he tells them he doesn't need to respect the rules of the gods and hits two of Odysseus' men, then decide to take a nap. The fact that he is the one to talk, even if he is a scary monster, feels more out there because it paints him as a creature with a capacity to reason like the man and have a lot of anthropomorphic traits despite his monstrous nature, which in turn align with a certain conception of feeling like supernatural elements are part of the world and accepted as such, rather than an intrusion to our reality. It's basically like when you read some legends, everyone seems to accept that dragons and other monsters just exist, even if they are still portrayed as threats. They are part of the logic of the world and the way they are perceived by the characters. That is felt in how Polyphemus is characterized as being capable of talking and thinking like humans, despite being a monster that doesn't exist, in how he lives taking care of his ships even if he hits people and is a giant. In comparison, the Cyclops in the movie is portrayed like an alien-like creature that doesn't feel like it has anthropomorphic traits outside of his appearance, and turns out he can indeed talk, because he's not treated as a being that could possibly exist, but as a creature that can't exist and violate the laws of the real world, demanding that he is treated as such. Again, this is not a bad thing, it makes the scene memorable, but in my opinion it doesn't align with how in fantasy settings the supernatural is accepted as part of the world. It's more of something that feels like breaking the rules of the real world. That is further highlighted by the fact that Polyphemus is seemingly living all alone in his island, whereas in the poem, the whole island was inhabited by several Cyclops. This number informs us that they are treated as a plausible, rational thing that does exist and is accepted as such by the people in this ancient Greek conception, but in the movie, Polyphemus being seemingly alone on his island makes him feel even more of an outsider. Just because a movie has mythical monsters in it or magic doesn't automatically make it fantasy. Fantasy requires that these surreal elements are treated as part of the world, not a violation of it. That's what distinguishes it from horror or supernatural. You can have fantasy stories where the protagonist was part of the ordinary world, but in general, you'll see that other characters tend to accept the magical elements as part of the world, and from there, they come in two categories. The category where there's a contemporary world that has none of it, and the everyday protagonist is isekai'd into a magical realm, or the category where magic and supernatural is part of the natural order of the universe at large, but a select part of the population her everyday protagonist pertains to doesn't know that this exists, and their discovery of it or the awakening of an ability. To stay on point with Greek mythology, the Percy Jackson series fall into the second category. The supernatural was always there and is part of the natural order of the world, but regular humans don't know that. Or a better example, but think of tales like Jack and the Magical Bean, the Little Foundling or stuff like that, because again, the concept of the hero finding himself trapped in the house of a giant man-eating creature is something that can be found in many stories in the world, and the portrayal of these creatures usually make us feel as though the fact that giants exist isn't questioned. They are seen as a feasible being, but a threatening one nonetheless. As a result, the portrayal of Polyphemus and Odysseus' crew's reaction to him aligns more with supernatural and horror than fantasy proper. And I don't think it's bad, again, I love that scene, but this again aligns with the idea that this movie is more on the side of a demystified adaptation of the Odyssey rather than a fantasy. The same can be said about the stop at Kirke's domain. That's another moment in the movie I actually enjoyed. The directions taken for how Kirke turns the men into pigs was genuinely good, but the way she turns them into pigs also aligns with the supernatural more than fantasy, and with this demystification of the poem. Instead of living in a palace and feeling more goddess than mortal, Kirke lives in a humble house and feels like a regular woman at first. She isn't intimidating, she doesn't have a mystical presence, and in the poem, the way that she transformed the men into animals, using drugs and a wand, align more with how magic was believed to work in ancient Greece than the way it is presented in Nolan's movie. This is basically in line with what I said about the way Polyphemus' presentation differs, but a large part why myths and fairy tales present supernatural elements as something that is part of the world, which ended up bleeding into the fantasy genre, is because back in the days, people used to believe that these things really existed. And in the case of magic, it was part of the lives of the people in ancient Greece. They believed that some objects could be used to cast a spell of misfortune or good fortune and so on. In presenting Kirke as living not in a palace but in a desolate island, all alone with her sister she turned into a bird, and turning men into pigs or other animals in the way that it is done, it is effectively a deconstruction of Kirke's portrayal in the Odyssey, thereby making it less magical and wondrous and more grounded. Then there's also Helen herself. Helen in the movie is strongly hinted at being merely an excuse that Agamemnon uses to be able to take over Troy, which is a choice that also aligns with a desire to make the story feel more grounded and less mythical. But let's stop on Helen's scars for a bit. A lot of people were wondering why she had those. While I think that the movie was trying to suggest that Menelaus was abusive toward his wife, I also think that this ties into the whole idea of demystification of the tale. By presenting Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman of the world, with scars on half of her face, it renders the idea that people would have started a war over it utterly ridiculous, since it doesn't align with what's typically expected when we talk about the most beautiful woman in the world. Scars, especially on the face, are not seen as appealing traditionally speaking. This means that anything that the Odyssey had to offer in terms of hyperbolic elements or supernatural elements was itself reworked around to fit into a new setting that is trying to be more historical and looking realistic. But at the same time, the setting does not resemble ancient Greece at all and hardly evokes it, which feels like a complete contradiction. The movie does want to feel realistic and historical, but at the same time, we have Agamemnon's hammer and the Viking boats in a story set in Greece, Bronze Age. This is especially weird with all that I've highlighted. The story tries so hard to provide a rationale for stuff like Athena showing up, or the lotus flower allowing one to forget, or to present the more fantastical elements in a way that is still demystified. But then, you see this visual and you're feeling completely lost. People have been clinging onto this one idea of the movie's story being fictional, giving it a free pass to do whatever, not realizing that the reason why this criticism is applicable is not only because of Nolan's choosing to retain an antique historical setting, but also the general direction that the movie is going for in how it presented the mythical story. The supernatural elements of the Odyssey are not taken as testifying of how the ancient Greek believed reality operated and taken seriously, but as a free pass to do whatever you want, because apparently, if you place one element that doesn't exist in your fictional story, it gives you the right to have the Eiffel Tower replace the Statue of Liberty in New York. But in an attempt to defend the movie outside of the it's fictional, it's fantasy argument, we had people bring up other mythological inspired movies or stories with a little nagging, how come I haven't been hearing anyone complain about Disney's Hercules not being historical? Never mind that the movie was literally criticized by the Greeks and that the Greek government had to cancel the airing of it back in the days. But let's say for the sake of the argument that we lived on an alternate side of the history where the movie didn't receive any backlash from Greece. The defense still wouldn't work, because when you're pointing to another movie, you aren't defending the Odyssey, you're just deflecting. It is actually possible to defend some of the decisions of Disney's Hercules in how it presents itself, because this is a retelling / reimagining of the legend of Heracles / Hercules with its own way of operating on a storytelling perspective. That being a musical with a lighter story as well as an animated movie. The liberties it takes in regards to the myth can be criticized when it comes to stuff like mixing Greek and Roman mythology, or the fact that it's more of a criticism of American show business under the skin of a Greek setting. But a lot of the choices it makes do not contradict the movie's thesis with how the story presents itself. It has its own internal consistency, and most importantly, The fantasy defense works a lot better with this movie considering it is embracing the supernatural. The gods are all present as characters and not phenomena that are felt. Supernatural creatures are part of the logic of this world and are presented as such to the audience, and the more cartoony and colorful designs help sell that point. Or how about Edipore and Medea by Pasolini? These are movies that people have been pointing out in terms of good movie adaptations of mythological stories. Even if these movies are taking a lot of artistic license in how they present the setting. But here, it actually makes more sense. Edipore is mainly following a Freudian reading of the myth as seen per the superposition of the myth with a contemporary setting. It is purposefully historical and mixing many stuff from different cultures because it is embracing being an oniric and strange movie to watch as a result of following psychoanalysis. It is in the benefit of the movie to feel like a weird mix of many cultures, and it allows you to feel immersed in a strange experience. Likewise, Medea is mainly inspired by free theorists in its portrayal of the myth, and it's this logic he is applying to his movie. Yes, aesthetic anachronism and artistic license are a thing, but they are applicable to a specific context in regards to the type of story you are faced with. It is difficult to have artistic license and use aesthetic anachronism when you settle for a proper setting that has existed with a specific area instead of being either purposefully vague or using it to your own advantage. Aesthetic anachronism has its own mechanics and way of working. Poorly used, it just breaks your sense of immersion. Therefore, it is not an automatic gateway to do whatever you want. In the case of the Odyssey, it genuinely didn't feel like it was purposefully trying to be anachronistic for the sake of aesthetic. It didn't feel artsy enough to feel that way, at least. If anything, it felt like the movie was trying to feel historical without taking notes after how hammers did look like in the Bronze Age. That's why the costumes are either feeling like they're taking after a medieval hammer or the boats, Viking boats. So that the movie can still feel ancient and historical without actually being historically accurate. That's the aesthetic of history. To me at least, anachronism works when it feels like the choices are informed and consistent with the direction of the overall story and aesthetic. However, within the Odyssey, this feels contradictory, not consistent, specifically because of the direction. Instead of having oniric, colorful settings, the scenes are grey, monotone, beige, and uses low lighting. When you see the suitors eating during the banquet, it doesn't feel like they're having a lavish party. It feels like you're seeing Viking-inspired warriors eat at a tavern. The food isn't presented as appealing, the scenes are dark. Again, this aligns with what I talked about in regards to the movie feeling demystifying and an aesthetic of groundedness. The grey gloominess of the movie makes sense given how the movie is dedicated to deconstruct Odysseus' guilt. Internally, it even justifies the necessity for a lack of marvelousness when meeting the different monsters and obstacles that Odysseus encounters. And if the movie was fantastical, it would not necessarily convey the state of spirit that the movie tells us Odysseus is dealing with. But in the context of the movie's setting, having a more accurate take on how Greece looked would have actually worked just as much as it did in the movie. I don't see how using contemporary language is necessary to transmit Odysseus' guilt. It just takes me out of the movie because I have to believe that we are in the Bronze Age, Greece, but the characters don't even attempt to speak a little more of the time. That's why I don't think it's relevant to bring up other movies as an attempt at deflecting criticism when the specific criticism of the Odyssey are all inscribed within the context of the movie being placed in a very specific time period, a very specific place, with said movie embracing a more grounded, realistic, and demystified take on the story. These criticisms are responding to Nolan's direction choices feeling contradictory, and saying it's alright just because it's a fantasy when the movie isn't trying to be fantasy and strips the fantasy away as much as it can to feel more gloomy and grey just misses the point entirely. What people expected when it came to historical accuracy was solely in regards to the setting that had been chosen by the director himself, and arguing that somehow people have been dumb or not being reasonable for expecting a story that advertises itself multiple times as taking place in ancient Greece in the Bronze Age and trying to present things under a more rational light or demystified to match with the psychology of Odysseus because there's a cyclops in it, so it's automatically fantasy. It's just the peak of being obtuse. What makes this worse is that stating that Greeks didn't try thinking boats as a remark of the movie's lacking accuracy doesn't mean that the movie is necessarily bad. There are movies that are not historically accurate but still have artistic merit, and others that are historically accurate but don't have anything particularly interesting going on. But the topic of the movie being good or bad isn't the topic of this video. I'm just tired of people using wrongful arguments to shut up criticism. If you want to defend the art direction of the Odyssey, it would be a lot more relevant to actually try to find an explanation as to why it's essential that they use a Nar to travel across the sea in order to convey Odysseus' guilt and internal struggles, rather than say it's okay because there's a giant one-eyed monster in the movie. Or were you expecting them to be speaking ancient Greek thrown around to people talking about how charming it is to hear contemporary language used in a movie that is set in the Bronze Age and tries to at least give off a historical vibe? Which, on that note, before Odysseus and his men arrive to the Cyclops Island, they stop on an island at some point, which I am assuming is taking after that point in the poem where they stop at Ismara, and they talk to a man who I suppose is Maron, and this man talk a different language. Now, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that he was talking in Greek. I am not an expert and I couldn't hear that well, but I did recognize some words. Need I say more? So I think I made it clear by now that, to me, the its fantasy argument never worked since it was set in a specific time of Greek history, but on top of that, when I watched the movie, the fantasy was evacuated, not without a reasoning, but it was evacuated. But this actually begs the question of why Nolan chose to keep the setting in a realistic Greece during the Bronze Age instead of making a decision that would give him more freedom in the direction department. Well, that's pretty simple. A lot of people describe this movie as basically Oppenheimer but make it Homer, and yeah, it's definitely that. Nolan's take on the Odyssey is far more focused on trying to analyze Odysseus' guilt for the events of Troy, the men he lost during the battle as part of his ploys, the lives he has taken, and eventually it's made clear during the movie that he isn't mentally ready to return to Ithaca. The flaws being actually his subconscious, making him derive from island to island, while he still feels the need to save his men because of his guilt. And that is placed in parallel with the collapse of the Bronze Age that is correlated to the fall of Troy. It's meant to have parallels with our own modern times, clearly. It is made to be speaking to the modern mind. But that is the reason why the movie clung onto the idea it was taking place in a realistic historical setting and trying to distance itself from the more ponderous dimension of Greek mythology that is found within the poem. That's why we have no really glorious location, and that instead they are all very grimy. Like sure, it's also Nolan's style, but it's to such an extent that none of the gorgeous locations described in the poem can even exist as such. It needs to be grim to evoke the idea that the Age of Bronze is falling apart. In that case, I do not see how the movie would not benefit even more from looking more accurate to the culture that it's depicting. From a purely artistic point of view, what is the reason that it could not have worked and that instead we have to settle with these strange visual choices that break the immersion that we are in the ancient time? From a purely artistic point of view, the clothing actually matching with the setting would have made things consistent. I wouldn't be finding myself out of so many scenes just because I laid eyes on something that felt out there and broke my immersion. It felt like waking up from a dream every 2 seconds. Now that being said, I still have some things to say, but this time it's about how this fantasy excuse was used in regards to Nolan's casting choices. Whether it's fantasy workers' argument is used in regards to defending Nolan's casting choices, it's a bit of a different story. It's basically a poor defense because right-wingers can't handle a black actress playing Helen of Troy, among other things. Because of course, simply making an argument that maybe Nolan couldn't hire Greek actors due to practical issues, an actual limitation that can happen sometimes, was apparently not reasonable enough. I personally don't think it was the issue considering how many big names are playing in this movie, but I digress. The problem with this argument is pretty simple. Some of the people among left-leaning people trying to defend the movie's diverse cast against right-wingers complaining about it not being historical enough and lacking Greek people in it are only doing this because it's coming out of the mouth of right-wingers. And also because Greek is white and Western, so they believe it doesn't struggle on the topic of representation as opposed to other cultures. Now the thing is that when right-wingers claim they are trying to defend the good name of Homer and Greece, I don't buy it! Because they are only going after a select number of actors, when not a single actor in the movie is Greek and should all be criticized by that token. Yet I see none of this energy thrown at Matt Damon, Anne Hathaway or Tom Holland. And that's because they get a pass since they are Western and white, and Greek is identified as white and Western. That is why I keep seeing people try to argue on whether the Greeks were white or not, or presenting women that are blonde and have blue eyes as Helen despite being women not Greek, but from the Anglo-Saxon world. And of course, people unironically trying to convince us that the English people or anyone living near the North European region would look like the Greeks. You know the Greeks who live in the South Europe, in the Balkan, near the Mediterranean region. I don't want to imply that Greeks look a certain way, because I find such assumptions based on the look of people to be very reductive, but let's be real here. If you are angry at the casting choices because Helen of Troy is played by a black woman, or that they are black and Asian people in Odysseus' crew under the claim of they aren't Greek, then why are you not making the same case for all the actors? And on top of that, offering actors who aren't Greek to play the role of these characters. That's because these people don't really care about Greece, and it's debatable if they've even read the Odyssey or anything related to Greek mythology in general. All that they see is wokeness or progressiveness. The thing is that the movie didn't exactly felt woke or progressive. If I'm being honest, I don't really see how a movie that chooses to omit Greek culture entirely is woke or progressive just because it has a diverse casting. That specific outrage is not a fair criticism because the one throwing it are biased. But this one is a very separate issue. Because the thing is, right-wingers have their own idea of what an accurate Greece is like, and it's essentially just a made-up land that doesn't correspond to the historical reality of Greece. That's the reason why they have been trying to rip the movie apart and hoping it flopped. What I don't like here with the fantasy defense is that it's just a deflection used instead of pointing out to the obvious issue, but I'll stop there on that side. Can artists take liberties with history? Absolutely, Is anachronism a valid aesthetic choice? Yes. Can that be applied to Nolan's Odyssey? No! Look, history is a complicated subject, so obviously, even when you do try to stay faithful to the reality of the time period, you might make some mistakes, and that itself isn't indicative of whether the story you write will be deprived of any artistic merit. But I find it worrying that somehow it's bad to point out that it's a rather contradictory mindset to want to create a movie that feels grounded and historical, placed in an ancient historical setting, with it being acknowledged multiple times, while we don't see a more accurate depiction of ancient Greece, and that instead we are supposed to sip it and swallow it because the presence of a cyclops is apparently all it takes to have the right to have a medieval hammer in the Bronze Age. I've said it multiple times in a row by this point, and I don't want to repeat this point again, but I personally think that it's been purposefully obtuse to argue against the idea that there can be ways in which artistic license and anachronism can actually be bad and harm your story's consistency. I don't think it's a big crime to be saying that if Nolan was interested in adapting the Odyssey without having to feel restricted by the wave of history, he could have used many ways to escape that issue. I've taken a lot of examples that I hope made it clear that I am not some deep Greek culture freak that needs every single line to be respected down to the punctuation, but in case you need one more example to show that if Nolan wasn't interested in Greek culture beyond the Odyssey itself, it could have worked. Asterix and Obelix have their own retelling of the 12 labors. It's called The 12 Tasks of Asterix, and it's a very free retelling of the myth. It can get away with evacuating Greek culture because of the specific direction of the story. In fact, the story has Kaiser been inspired by the myths, so it acknowledges the root of the story, but it still does its own thing, and that is fine because it's consistent. There were many ways that it could have worked, but it is what it is. I am not especially disappointed by Nolan's depiction of fantasy. I think it makes sense with the context of the movie. But I cannot stand the way that this argument is used as a way to shush people who have the reasonable reaction of questioning the art direction of the movie in the context of the setting, especially with the way that the movie distances itself from being fantasy.